Right now, Bitcoin is actually moving towards the downside after grabbing the liquidity towards the top side, and history looks like it's exactly repeating right now. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about what is happening for the short-term price action, what can we expect moving forward, and what we're going to be seeing for the long term, since of course Bitcoin is repeating history. So we need to be talking about what is likely to be happening for the rest of the cycle. So with that being said, let's not waste any more time. Let's get straight away into towards this banger. Bow. So looking at this chart, you can see that Bitcoin's actually grabbed the liquidity towards the top side, and we're actually moving towards the downside after we had our FOMC meeting. And of course, you can see by this chart over here, Bitcoin has actually started to move towards the downside already, just like the previous FOMC meetings we had in the past. You can see the past 5 times, we've actually moved towards the downside and had negative price action after our FOMC meeting. And of course, this exactly is playing out right now, since we are already moving towards the downside, just like the previous pattern that we actually had. And of course, it brings the question, if we do break this upward sloping trend line, it is likely we are going to be moving further towards the downside. So of course, right now, we need to be anticipating what's going to be happening once we do reach this trend line, because if we continue to move further below the trend line, it's likely we're going to be seeing some follow through and we're going to be moving towards the downside. But of course, looking at the news, so about 2 days ago, we had our FOMC meeting, and Jerome Powell actually mentioned the fact that the energy prices are rising, which is going to be driving inflation higher. And of course, this actually affected the interest rate probabilities. And you can see right now that it is more likely that we are going to be getting an interest rate pause and nothing's going to be happening moving forward. And we're not going to be getting the anticipated rate cuts that we were already anticipating at the later stages of 2025 for 2026. And of course, you can see since yesterday, the probability of a rate hike has actually increased about 6%, since of course we're seeing oil prices actually start to surge, and of course we're seeing the predicted oil prices continue to actually move higher. Estimates from analysts are actually anticipating higher oil prices, since we're having strikes on the Iranian gas plants, and of course this causes a supply shock. So of course, this is something that's not going to be good for the markets, since of course, if we're not going to be getting rate cuts and the probabilities for a rate hike continue to surge, then that means the liquidity is not going to be in the system. It's actually going to be negative for risk assets, since of course the higher the interest rate, the more incentive there is to save than invest, which actually drains liquidity from the market. And we know that Bitcoin and of course the S&P are risk assets. So speaking about the S&P, you can see by this chart over here, things are not looking too good also, since we're seeing the S&P start to top. We're seeing a topping structure since it's starting to roll over. And of course, this begs the question that if S&P crashes again, it is likely that Bitcoin is going to be following. And of course, this is going to lead to Bitcoin actually having a bigger move towards the downside. So this is one thing that we need to be bearing in mind. If the S&P actually starts to roll over, it's likely that Bitcoin actually follows and we move towards the downside. So this is one thing that I want to be mentioning on today's video. I will say also that it's important that we watch the GDP numbers that are forecasted to come out and what actually comes out for the GDP numbers, since of course we're seeing a massive downturn in the GDP, and of course with high inflation and lower GDP, that actually begs the question, are we going to be seeing stagflationary pressures? Are we going to be seeing a recession actually come into play, which can actually lead to liquidity injections further on later in the cycle? And if that plays into the timing that we do have of the Bitcoin bottom, then it's likely that we get a bottom once we do get some sort of liquidity injection due to maybe harsher economic conditions, and Bitcoin actually starts to move a lot lower. So of course, this is one narrative that we can be bearing in mind for the long term. So we need to be looking at what the GDP numbers are going to be once they do come out later on, since of course this is definitely going to affect the decisions moving forward for the Fed. And of course, we're going to be seeing what's likely to be happening in terms of liquidity for the market. But if we look at poly market and we look at the probabilities for a ceasefire, it is actually quite likely that this is going to be dragged on till the end of the year, looking at what traders are pricing in. So of course, if this does play out and the probabilities remain low that we'll get a ceasefire soon, then it's likely that this is going to drag out, and of course inflation is going to continue to rise, which actually plays into the narrative that the midterm year is going to be bearish and we're not going to be seeing higher prices for a while. But of course, price action told us this first. We mentioned in the distribution range in about summer of 2025 that it's likely we've topped for the cycle, and it's likely we're going to be moving down. And I covered this on the channel, and it's exactly playing out. So this is no surprise to us. The news has come out now, and the narratives are actually following what price action told us. before. So of course, this is one thing to be bearing in mind when it comes towards a Bitcoin bottom. It is likely that if we actually play out this range now and we actually break towards the downside, it's likely we form a bottom, since the market maker sell model only has one distribution range before one more leg down, and then that's where we start to form a bottom. So of course, price action can actually tell us that we'll bottom first before the news starts to turn around, and that's one thing that I'll look and actually bear in mind when actually calling a Bitcoin bottom. But of course, the trends still remain down. We're seeing our EMA ribbons still are bearish and moving towards the downside. So price action is likely to continue to move toward the downside until we can actually reclaim the EMA ribbons. Then that's where we're going to be seeing a confirmed trend shift, and we can actually look forward to a bull market again. And of course, looking at the ranges so far, we've had a deviation of the top side, like I've mentioned, and every time that we've had a deviation of the top side of the range, we always trade towards the lower side of the range. So of course, I do think that this is going to be another scenario where we actually trade to the lower side of the range for Bitcoin, and it is likely that we break towards the downside. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And the signal that we're going to be seeing a break towards the downside is if we start to lose this trend line over here, it's likely that we're going to be continuing towards the downside over there. And as for Ethereum, it is likely that it follows Bitcoin at a higher beta. So of course, if we continue to consolidate here and break towards the downside, the next major support levels for Ethereum will be 1,500. And if we continue to move lower later in the cycle, I think the next support level will be at $1,000 for Ethereum. And this region over here is going to be a great accumulation region to be getting long-term spot Ethereum for your portfolios. So that's one thing that I will be covering on the channel if we do get to those levels. But of course, I do think in a longer time frame, we're already at a discounted price for Ethereum and for Bitcoin also. So it is a great opportunity to actually be buying Bitcoin. And of course, we know long-term Bitcoin has a fixed supply. It's a risk asset that is pegged against the dollar, and the more the dollar actually depreciates in value due to debasement, Bitcoin moves higher. So of course, I do think that at these levels and lower, it's a great opportunity to be accumulating Bitcoin. But yeah, that'll be it from me. Make sure to be following me on X to be staying up to date with all my updates. I'll be seeing you guys in the next one. Have a blessed rest of your day. Peace, guys. See ya. Bye-bye.